Something is seriously wrong inside the Indiana Fever organization. Not the kind of wrong that shows up in a box score or gets mentioned in a post-game press conference. The kind of wrong that builds quietly, game after game, decision after decision, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And heading into tonight's game against the Chicago Sky, that pattern has reached a point where you simply cannot talk about what happens on the floor without first addressing what's happening behind closed doors, because the two are no longer separate stories. They are the same story. This isn't about one bad game or one controversial decision. This is about an organizational culture that has been documented, tracked, and analyzed across an entire season, and what it means for the most important player in women's professional basketball right now. Before a single minute of competitive basketball is played tonight, the dynamics surrounding this game demand an honest conversation, and that conversation starts with Sophie Cunningham. Cunningham is listed as questionable for tonight's game with a right elbow injury. On the surface, that's a routine injury designation. Players get hurt. It happens. But nothing about the timing of this designation feels routine to anyone who has been paying attention, because this questionable tag didn't arrive in isolation. It arrived in the immediate aftermath of a viral Instagram episode that sent shockwaves through the Fever fanbase, an episode involving Cunningham publicly celebrating Caitlin Clark's game-winning sequence, a post that was then deleted, followed by a public retraction that left more questions than it answered. Connect those dots, and the picture that emerges is not a comfortable one. The fan community connected them almost instantly. The analytical community connected them just as fast. And the dominant interpretation, shared widely, discussed loudly, and grounded in the documented behavior of this organization across this entire season, is that this injury designation is not purely medical in its origins. The reading that has taken hold is that Cunningham, by demonstrating visible public solidarity with Clark in a way that the coaching staff and front office did not design, did not sanction, and apparently did not appreciate, has now found herself in a deployment situation that carries organizational messaging beyond anything a right elbow can explain. Whether the elbow is genuinely bothering her or not almost becomes secondary to the message being communicated, because regardless of the physical reality, the roster is watching. Every player in that locker room sees exactly what happened. A teammate showed public support for Clark in a moment that clearly made organizational leadership uncomfortable. Days later, that same teammate is suddenly questionable. You don't need a front office memo to understand what that sequence of events means for how you should conduct yourself going forward. The message lands whether it was intended to or not. And in an organization where the coaching staff's relationship with its own roster has been described as carrying visible tension, that kind of unspoken message carries enormous weight. But here's what makes this more than just a Cunningham story, because the same organizational pattern that appears to have landed on her is a pattern with a prior victim, and that victim's name is Lexie Hull. Hull has been one of the quieter injustices of this Indiana Fever season. Quiet because she doesn't make noise about it. Quiet because she handles her situation with a professionalism that should be embarrassing to the organization that is creating it. But the numbers are not quiet. The numbers are loud, and they have been screaming the same thing for weeks. 6 minutes in first halves while shooting at perfect efficiency. 22 total minutes in games where her field goal percentage justified 30. These are not the deployment numbers of a player who is struggling to earn her role. These are the deployment numbers of a player whose role is being systematically and deliberately limited in ways that have nothing to do with what she's producing on the floor. And the analytical community has been tracking the most likely explanation with specificity across multiple games. Hull's friendship with Caitlin Clark, visible, genuine, and well-documented, appears to be generating organizational discomfort, and that discomfort appears to be showing up in her minutes. That connection is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern observation grounded in production data that cannot be explained by basketball logic. When a player is shooting at perfect efficiency and receiving 6 minutes of first-half action while the team struggles to establish offensive rhythm, the explanation is organizational, not competitive. And the organizational explanation that fits the documented facts of this season points directly at the relationship between Hull and Clark and the apparent discomfort that relationship produces within a coaching staff that has never publicly explained its reasoning in terms that hold up analytically. What makes Hull's situation even more pointed is the history of broken promises that surrounds it. When Hull was displaced earlier in the season by roster additions that were subsequently released without any clear public accounting from Stephanie White about what happened, why it happened, or what the plan was going forward, the coaching staff offered nothing. No transparent explanation, no acknowledgement of what Hull had been promised or what had changed. The players watching that situation understood exactly what it meant. Promises made to players inside this organization can disappear without explanation, and the coaching staff that declined to provide that accounting is the same coaching staff making Hull's deployment decisions tonight, in the full organizational shadow of the Cunningham episode. That is not coincidence. That is a consistent organizational decision-making culture expressing itself with remarkable consistency across multiple situations and multiple players. And the warning heading into tonight's game is real. Hull's minutes could take a further hit, not because she has done anything wrong, not because her production has declined, but because the organizational environment surrounding this team has established a pattern of deploying players in ways that reflect organizational messaging rather than competitive optimization. And Hull, as Caitlin's most consistent and personally invested teammate supporter, sits in a vulnerable position within that pattern. Think about what that means for Caitlin Clark walking into tonight's game. Her two most visible protectors on this roster, the teammates who have been most willing to physically and emotionally have her back, are both in compromised positions. Cunningham, who has stepped into confrontational situations during games to physically protect Clark, who has been the teammate willing to get in someone's face when the physical play crosses lines, is questionable. Hull, whose defensive competitiveness and personal investment in Clark's well-being have been genuinely visible across the season, is facing a deployment situation where her minutes could be further limited for reasons that have nothing to do with basketball. And facing them tonight is Jacy Sheldon on the Chicago Sky roster. If you know the history between Sheldon and Clark, you already understand why this matters. Sheldon's willingness to impose physical contact on Clark in competitive situations is documented. The physicality of their matchup history is a known element that any competent coaching staff accounts for specifically in competitive preparation. Navigating that kind of physical opposition requires having teammates who will respond when the contact crosses lines, teammates who will make it known through their own physicality and their own presence on the floor that Clark is not competing alone, and that there are consequences for playing outside the boundaries. With Cunningham's availability uncertain and Hull's deployment potentially limited, Clark may be walking into a physical matchup situation with a reduced protection structure around her. And that is a direct consequence of organizational decisions that were made off the floor in response to Instagram posts and personal relationships rather than in response to competitive basketball considerations. The organizational dysfunction and the competitive environment are not separate tonight. They are the same problem wearing different jerseys. Now, none of this changes the raw competitive reality of this matchup, which is that the Chicago Sky are 4-12 and should not, on paper, be presenting Indiana with a serious competitive challenge. The Fever, with their talent properly organized and properly deployed, are a significantly better roster than what Chicago is currently presenting. But that phrase, properly organized and properly deployed, is doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence. And the recent competitive history of this Indiana team provides some important cautionary context.
The previous game was against the Washington Mystics. The Mystics were not trying to win in any competitive sense. They are a rebuilding program operating with minimal investment in individual game outcomes, going through the motions of a season designed to position themselves for the future rather than compete in the present. Indiana nearly lost to them. Nearly. Against a team actively not trying to win, the Fever found themselves in a situation where the outcome required a Caitlin Clark game winner in a broken play situation that the coaching staff did not design and did not get credit for. Clark rescued a result that the organizational dysfunction around her had nearly turned into an embarrassment.
That near disaster is the competitive context you carry into tonight's Chicago Sky game, because the Sky, despite their losing record, are not the Mystics. They are not a team checking boxes and looking toward next year. They have individual talent capable of exploiting organizational dysfunction when they encounter it, and they will encounter it tonight if the Fever are not fully focused and collectively committed from the opening possession. Skylar Diggins is the competitive focal point for Chicago, and she deserves specific attention before this ball goes up. 15 points and 4 assists per game. Those numbers tell part of the story. What the numbers don't fully capture is the competitive intelligence behind them. Diggins is a veteran in every meaningful sense of that word. She has seen every kind of defensive scheme, every kind of team, every kind of organizational environment across her career. She knows how to read competitive situations. She knows how to identify defensive breakdowns before they fully develop. She knows how to find angles that younger, less experienced players would miss entirely. An Indiana team whose internal organizational dynamics have been generating visible complexity for weeks is precisely the kind of environment that a player like Diggins has been trained by experience to exploit. Distracted teams make defensive mistakes. Teams carrying internal tension lose focus in transition moments. Teams where individual players are managing organizational messaging in addition to competitive responsibilities have lapses that veterans find and attack. If the Fever are not collectively committed and specifically prepared to contain Diggins from the opening possession across all 40 minutes, she will manufacture the kind of individual performance that makes a 4-8 team competitive against a roster that should be handling them decisively. Camila Cardoso is the interior challenge that Aaliyah Boston needs to answer. 13 points and 9 rebounds per game. That is genuine front court presence, the kind of interior production that creates problems for teams that are not specifically prepared and actively engaged in the paint. Boston has produced competitive results against Cardoso in their prior matchups, and that historical advantage needs to be activated from the first possession and maintained consistently across 40 minutes. If Boston allows Cardoso to establish interior rhythm early, offensive rebounds, post-scoring, physical presence around the basket, the Sky have a pathway to keeping this game far closer than the talent differential justifies. Boston has the tools to prevent that. Whether she brings the competitive engagement and physical commitment to use those tools consistently is the question the production record of this season leaves genuinely open. Strip away all the organizational context, all the deployment drama, all the Instagram episodes and injury timing controversies, and what remains is a basketball question with a straightforward answer. How does Indiana win this game decisively, not survive it on individual heroics, but win it in a manner that reflects the actual talent gap between these two rosters? The answer begins and ends with Caitlin Clark having the ball in her hands. That is the foundational competitive reality of every Indiana game. And it is the reality that has been most consistently undermined by the offensive system and the deployment philosophy that Stephanie White's coaching produces. When Clark is the primary decision-maker, when possessions flow through her reads, her creativity, her basketball intelligence, this team is capable of competing with and defeating anyone in this league.
When the offense routes primary creative responsibility elsewhere, and Clark is functioning as a movement piece within a system not organized around her capabilities, Indiana struggles to separate from opponents with no business keeping games close. Against Chicago tonight, the competitive prescription is not complicated. Give Clark the ball from the opening possession and keep giving it to her. Let her establish rhythms against a defense that does not possess the individual talent to contain her when she is operating with freedom and making decisions in real time. Let what she generates through her instincts and her vision be the engine of the offense, rather than a component within an organizational scheme that routes possessions elsewhere and then expects her to rescue the result when the clock is running out. The screen-setting dimension of this game carries specific weight that cannot be understated. Aaliyah Boston's documented struggles with setting effective screens have been a recurring production issue across the season. The missed blocking assignments, the inadequate positioning, the half-hearted physicality that observers have noted in game after game. These are not minor cosmetic issues. Effective screens are the structural mechanism through which Clark generates the separation from defensive coverage that makes her three-point shot and her driving game operate at full efficiency. Clark fighting through poorly set screens or navigating defensive contact without structural support from the offensive system is Clark carrying a load the scheme is supposed to distribute. Boston setting real, physical, committed screens in this game is not a stylistic preference. It is a foundational, competitive requirement, and the production record suggests it is a requirement that has been consistently unmet.
Kelsey Mitchell's role in this game carries its own competitive importance. There were signs in the previous game of marginally improved passing participation, a slight directional shift toward genuine ball movement that represented a positive development from the patterns characterizing her play earlier in the season. But the tendency to dribble possessions into isolation attempts, to exhaust shot clock without reading the defensive coverage and finding the open player, is a tendency that emerges quickly when competitive pressure increases and individual scoring becomes the psychological default. Against Chicago, with Clark working to establish rhythm and the team needing collective offensive execution to separate cleanly from a 4-8 opponent, Mitchell's commitment to genuine ball distribution is not optional. The assist numbers need to reflect a player reading the game and making decisions accordingly, not accumulating shot attempts while Clark and other open players wait for possessions that never arrive. Here is the larger story that the organizational moment around this game is telling. At the beginning of the season, the Indiana Fever rolled out a championship narrative, confident public assertions about competing for titles, organizational excellence, a roster built to contend. Those assertions arrived with genuine fanfare and were received with genuine enthusiasm from a fan base that had been waiting a long time for something real to believe in. That championship conversation has essentially disappeared from public organizational discourse. Nobody is discussing titles in Indianapolis right now. The conversation is about Instagram posts and their deletions, about injury designations and their timing, about deployment decisions that appeared to carry organizational messaging beyond competitive optimization, about a locker room atmosphere that observers have described as carrying visible tension that players are navigating in addition to the competitive demands of a professional basketball season. The distance between where this organization said it was going and where it actually finds itself is not a small gap. It is the distance between championship contention and organizational dysfunction, and it has been covered in a direction nobody anticipated. That is the environment Caitlin Clark is competing within, not just tonight, but every night. She is operating within an organizational structure that has consistently made her job harder than it needs to be, consistently deployed the players around her in ways that limit the competitive environment she operates within, and consistently failed to provide the organizational clarity and stability that a roster with genuine championship aspirations requires. And yet, the results she produces, the game winners in broken play situations, the individual performances that rescue results the organizational environment around her does not deserve, continue to arrive with a consistency that speaks to something genuinely extraordinary about her as a competitive entity.
She is capable of delivering a dominant performance against this Chicago roster tonight. The competitive talent is fully present, fully intact, and fully capable of making the Sky's 4-8 record look exactly as limited as it is on paper. Against Sheldon's physicality, against Diggins' veteran craftiness, against Cardoso's interior presence, Clark has the individual tools to impose her will on this game in a way that makes the final score reflect the actual talent differential between these teams. The question that tonight's game will answer, the same question that virtually every game this season has answered in some form, is whether the organizational structure surrounding Clark will create the conditions for that performance to fully materialize. Whether Stephanie White and the coaching staff will organize the offense around the player who makes it work and give her the ball and the freedom she needs to operate. Whether the screen-setting failures and ball distribution problems that have been the documented story of this season will be addressed with competitive urgency or allowed to continue limiting what this team should be capable of producing. Whether the players in compromised deployment situations will receive the minutes their production justifies, or whether the organizational messaging embedded in those deployment decisions will take priority over competitive optimization. The Chicago Sky are 4-8. Caitlin Clark is the most important player in women's professional basketball. The Indiana Fever should win this game convincingly. Every element of the organizational context surrounding that simple competitive reality is, as this entire season has been, anything but simple. The ball goes up tonight. The organizational dynamics are fully in play, and everyone who has been paying attention all season knows exactly what to watch for, exactly what questions are being answered, and exactly what it means when the answers arrive.